Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So in this video, I want to rank Stephen King by decades. And what I mean by that is that Stephen King is such a prolific author, and he's written more than 70 books, and they're literally decade spanning. And he's written in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. His first published book came out in 1974, and it was Carrie. And his latest book, which just came out this month, later in 2021. Wow. There's a lot of disgruntled King fans that like to point out that most of Stephen King's best works were in the 70s and the 80s. That was his prime. And anything past like 1987, 1988 is just not even worth reading. But if you're a true constant reader, you know that's not true. He's written so many great books in the 90s and the 2000s. And even his latest book was great. So in this video, I kind of want to explore what are my favorite decades that King has written in. And it's kind of hard because every decade that he's written in has great books, and they also have some of my least favorite books, so it's kind of hard to kind of pinpoint like what is my favorite. But it was pretty simple to decide what my least favorite decade was, and that is the 2000s. Anything between 2000 and 2009. Easily my least favorite decade. This decade just has a lot of either just bad books, books that I just didn't personally enjoy, or books that I'm kind of lukewarm about. I'll quickly talk about some of the books that I really just don't like. This Black House, this is actually the only Stephen King book I have not been able to finish. I've tried several times and I can't get into it. I don't know. And then you've got something like Dreamcatcher, which it starts out great, but the middle chunk of the book and the ending is just, ugh. From a Buick 8, it's fine, but it's just very repetitive, not great King. You've got Lisa's or Liza's story, I never know how to pronounce it, but either way, it's not very good. And you've got Cell, which it's fine, but then again, it's not that great. Everything's Eventual. I'd say it's a mixed bag. Some of these stories are really good, some of them are very forgettable. And then this might be a little controversial, but it's my least favorite Dark Tower book, Wolves of the Kala. Just a chunky old book, and I'm just not a huge fan of it, even though I'm a huge Dark Tower fan. My least favorite Dark Tower book. But even though this is my least favorite decade, it still has some terrific books. One of them, and this is pretty controversial, but I really like The Colorado Kid. It's just like a little novella, but I really like it. A lot of people don't. That's their problem. And then, of course, you have books 6 and 7 of The Dark Tower, both very good. You've got Just After Sunset, which is one of his best collections, in my opinion. And then easily the two best books for me in this particular decade are Under the Dome, chunky book, even though it has a terrible ending. The rest of the book is just so good. And then a book that I would more than likely put in my top 10, Doomakey. So even though this is by far my least favorite decade, it still has one of my all-time favorite King books. And then my second least favorite decade would be the 90s. Easily my least favorite from the 90s is his collection Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It's a short story collection, but look how friggin' long it is. All these short stories are just too long. They're tedious. They're boring. I don't like it. And then some of his novels that I just don't really like. Rose Matter has, again, such a great start, but he shoehorns in a supernatural element that just, it ruins the story for me. This one's kind of interesting. Bag of Bones. I remember really not enjoying this book, but I often see a lot of people on YouTube who do Stephen King videos say that this is one of their favorites. I do want to reread this to try to see if I have a different opinion, but I remember really not enjoying this. Same thing with Insomnia. A lot of people really like this. I think I've read it in the past few years, and I still thought it was really boring. I was not a huge fan. And then this is a very unpopular opinion. The Stand. It's fine, but good lord, man. It is too long. And then some books that are, you know, pretty good. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. It's not my favorite, but it's short enough that I can read it and be fine with it. Another one is Desperation. It, you know, 3-star read. A little too long, but it's fine. And then 4 Past Midnight, which is my least favorite novella collection from King. I'm a huge fan of his novellas, and this is by far my least favorite. But again, even though the 90s is one of my least favorite decades, it still has some of my favorite King books of all time. I mean, come on, you got The Green Mile. Like, what is there to say about The Green Mile that already hasn't been said? And then a book that I could easily put in like my top 20, maybe even top 15, Needful Things. Such a good book, and a good example of King writing a good long story. And you've got Dolores Claiborne and Gerald's Game, both great female protagonist-led stories. And you've got Hearts in Atlantis, which I think is like a mosaic kind of novel. It's got some short stories and novellas, and they're all kind of connected. This is easily a top 20 book for me. And then I'll even throw in The Regulators, which is the companion book to Desperation. A lot of people like one way more than the other. So if you like Desperation, you don't like this one so much. But I'm not a huge fan of Desperation, and I really like The Regulators. I also forgot to mention that in the 90s, you also have 2 terrific Dark Tower books. You've got The Wastelands, Book 3, and you've got Wizard and Glass, Book 4. Both terrific books. And I'll just throw in the decade of the 20s, just as an afterthought, because he only has 2 books so far in the 20s, but they're both 5-star reads for me. If It Bleeds is terrific, and this is his new book later, also very, very good. And then the decade that I kind of have in the middle, I like it a little bit more than the 90s and the 2000s, and a little less than the 70s and 80s, are the 2010s. This is a decade that often King fans cite as just not being as good as classic Stephen King, because a lot of these books aren't horror. They're not your typical Cujo, Misery, Pet Sematary, It. He kind of branches off into different genres, and a lot of people don't like that. But it's a shame, because King writes good in all genres. I will say, this decade has a lot of great books, and the only 3 books that I'm just not very big on are The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, one of his weaker short story collections, End of Watch, which is the 3rd book in the Bill Hodges trilogy. Again, I hate when he adds unnecessary supernatural elements. That might be a spoiler, but you know, it's King. And then one of the worst things he's ever written is Elevation. Just, it's crap. And then there's some books that I'm, you know, a little lukewarm about. They're not bad by any means, but they're nowhere near my favorites. You've got one of his newer books, The Institute. It starts out pretty good, but, you know, I thought the ending to this was just weird, and it just wasn't for me. And you've got Sleeping Beauties, and I really love the first half of this book, where we get introduced to the basic premise, and you get introduced to all the characters, but it really just bogs down by the second half, and it's a slog fest. Same thing with this book, 11/22/63. Great premise, starts out terrific, and then the middle chunk of the book is just romance. and I don't care about that. But then this decade just has a bunch of great books. Joyland, just a little hard case crime book, terrific. Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining. I know a lot of people don't like it as much as The Shining, but I think it's terrific. You've got Mr. Mercedes, which is pretty good start to the Bill Hodges trilogy, but I really like Finders Keepers, which is the second book in the series. I like this book the most. You've got Revival, which is just King writing just a terrific story and a great example of King having a terrific ending to a story. And you've got The Outsider, which is just terrific. Not a perfect book, but damn near perfect. And there's also book 4.5 of The Dark Tower, The Wind Through the Keyhole. Perfectly good book. And you've got Gwendy's Button Box, which is just a little tiny novella. A lot of people think it's okay, but I think it's actually one of the best things he's written. And then you've got yet another novella collection. I love novellas, and this one is just terrific. Full Dark, No Stars. And I know I probably look like a hypocrite complaining about King fans who say that Stephen King's best books are written in the 70s and 80s. And it is true, but the main reason I wanted to do this video was just to show off all of the great King books that are in his so-called bad decades or past his prime, which is just bullcrap. But saying that, my second favorite decade is the 70s. Many of the books written in this decade by King would easily make my top 20 or even my top 10 King books. You've got Carrie, one of the greatest debut books of all time, probably. You've got Salem's Lot, a very gripping and scary vampire story. You've got The Shining, which, do I really need to say anything? You've got probably his best short story collection in Night Shift. You've got one of his best Richard Bachman books, The Long Walk. And you've got quite possibly my favorite King book of all time, The Dead Zone. I think the main two reasons why this isn't quite my favorite decade is one, there's just not a lot of books compared to the output that he had in the 80s, which makes sense because his first book came out in 1974, so he didn't quite have the whole 70s to put out books. And the other reason is just because, like, The Stand, which, this is the original edition. I have not read it, but I'm not even a huge fan of the uncut version. And then the other reason is the book that's in this bind-up, which is Rage, one of the Bachman books. Easily one of my least favorite King books ever. It has its fans, but I was not a huge fan. And of course, since the 70s are my second favorite decade, the 80s is my favorite. And probably a lot of people would agree with me. Either 70s or 80s. You can't really go wrong. And again, this is just a damn near perfect decade output for King. A lot of these books I would put in my top 10, my top 20. They're just, almost all of them are super good. And good lord, there's a lot of them. You got Firestarter, you got Cujo, you got Christine, you got Pet Sematary, you got Eyes of the Dragon, you got It, you got Misery, you got The Dark Half, you've got some great Bachman books, you've got The Running Man, you've got Roadwork, and you've got Thinner. You've got the first two Dark Tower books, you got The Gunslinger, and my personal favorite Dark Tower book, Drawing of the Three. You've got a very good novella collection in different seasons, and you've got one of his best short story collections, Skeleton Crew. And I'll throw in Cycle of the Werewolf. Not one of my favorites, but still good. And the only two books that came out in the 80s that I didn't like. In fact, I would go as far to say I hate these books. These are the only two books that keep the 80s as being as perfect as it already is. One of those is the Tommyknockers. Oh god, it starts out with a lot of potential, but just it goes nowhere fast. And then easily my least favorite King book that I've finished is The Talisman. I like almost nothing about this book. Just I don't like it. But besides those two crappy books, the 80s is just chock full of great novels, great Bachman books, Dark Tower books. You even got a short story and novella collection in there. Just, you got a little bit of everything. But again, just because a lot of King's best books came out in the 70s and the 80s doesn't mean that you should discount anything that came out after that. 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and now the 20s, they all, you know, they have some stinkers in them, right? Because King is trying out different stuff. He's not just writing horror anymore, and a lot of people don't like that. But he's just got so many great books in his later decades, past his so-called prime. A book is good on its own merit, no matter what decade it came out in. Like, if you read it and you like it, it's good. It doesn't matter. I may have forgotten a book or two. I'm not sure. There's probably some nonfiction that I forgot, you know, like Dance Macabre and On Writing. I'm pretty sure I forgot to mention those, but for the most part, I think I went over the majority of my books. And now I have a very big mess to clean up, and I'm gonna have to rearrange my bookshelf, because, yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. What are some of your favorite Stephen King decades? Do you agree with me, or do you not agree with me? Let me know down in the comments below. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.